Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 288. This week the questions are taken from guides 360 and 361, that's HMS Implacable, the big carrier, and USS Frost, Destroyer Escort 144, along with the Wednesday videos from about Admiral Cunningham in 1939 and 1940, the US Pacific Fleet Submarine Campaign in late 1943, and a guest question or two from the video on Austro-Hungarian firearms. So, let's proceed with questions. Vicky asks, why was Hiei's armour able to mostly keep out San Francisco shells at the Friday the 13th engagement? NavWeb's armour penetration data for the 8-inch 55 gun used by the treaty heavy cruisers of the US indicates that San Francisco's main battery should be able to penetrate an 8-inch maximum belt, i.e. a Congo, at up to 12,500 yards. So at the hundreds of yards ranges or slightly more that San Francisco is engaging Hiei, its shells should have been able to essentially ignore the battlecruiser's armour completely. But instead, San Francisco was mostly unable to penetrate Hiei's main belt armour, only managing to tear up the superstructure and land a single penetrating hit aft of the Citadel that flooded the steering gear and left the ship unmanoeuvrable. So why did Hiei's belt armour overperform so spectacularly against San Francisco? So there's a few things to consider, one of which is that whilst the wreck of Hiei was discovered back in, I think it was 2019, I don't believe the release date, at least as far as I can tell, did a full exploration of the ship's armour belt, and indeed the ship is upside down, so it's possible some of that might be submerged. So I don't know if anyone has done a full analysis of the whole range of the ship's armour belt to see if any of it was penetrated. Obviously, if someone has, and there's an article out there somewhere that I've missed, then please link it in the description below. But even if Hiei's belt was penetrated, unless you hit something vital that's relatively high in the ship, like, say, the steering system, at that close range, you have the paradox of, yes, San Francisco's guns would be able to penetrate Hiei's belt, but it wouldn't really do all that much, because obviously the belt armour is there to protect the magazines and the machinery spaces, which are generally below the waterline anyway, and at that range, San Francisco is essentially flat shooting, which means that if a shell does penetrate through the upper portion of Hiei's belt armour, it's pretty much going to just continue in a straight line and do something inside the ship, but it's not going to come near any of the vitals of the vessel. So, you know, it's possible that there are perforations of Hiei's belt armour along the midship section, but we just haven't seen and analysed them yet because they didn't do anything substantially damaging to the ship until obviously the subsequent air attacks made her list, and then possibly they would have admitted some more water. Plus, as you mentioned, you know, the rest of Hiei is being shot up as well, so every shell that's landing there is a shell that, by inference, is not landing on the belt armour in the first place. The other thing you have to consider is that, generally speaking, unless deliberately specified, armour penetration tables tend to consider a broadside versus broadside action, where both ships are, relatively speaking, level with each other, and so the impact is coming in at 90 degrees, obviously with the fall of shot, which, as we said in this case, is not going to be all that much. Whereas if, for example, San Francisco opened fire when Hiei was at a bearing of about 45 degrees to her, and that could be a case of, you know, Hiei being on a course that is essentially at that angles the ship at 45 degrees to San Francisco, or San Francisco could be ahead or behind the ship, so they could be on parallel courses, either in the same direction or opposite, but separated by a few thousand yards ahead or behind, and that can give the same effective angle as well. And at that point, at 45 degrees, 8 inches of belt armour suddenly becomes just over 11 inches effective thickness, which then could be enough to repel an 8-inch shell. So I think it's a combination of probably angle of impact increasing the apparent thickness of the armour, which would be a problem at those kinds of ranges. Again, it's this sort of the swings and roundabouts of an extremely close range engagement, because if you are, let's say, leading an enemy ship by 2,000 yards, but you're 20,000 yards away, the overall effect that has in increasing the apparent angle of impact of your shells when you're targeting the enemy ship and you hit the belt armor is going to be relatively little. Whereas if you're 2,000 yards ahead and 2,000 yards away, that leads you to the 45-degree situation that I just described. And if you're only 1,000 yards away but 2,000 yards ahead, then the angles become even steeper and the apparent thickness of the belt is even greater, even though your apparent penetration has increased quite dramatically because you're so much closer. But the angle at which you can actually inflict that damage has reduced quite a bit. Plus the fact that, as we said, their flat shooting may have resulted in some penetrating hits that didn't actually substantially impair Hiei due to not actually hitting anything vital, essentially just sailing right over them. Lessons Learned asks, I have a question about British carrier-based fighter aircraft, or the lack thereof at the start of World War II. The Royal Navy lacked any useful fighters or interceptors in spite of its innovations in carrier design and tactics, and had to rely on either foreign designs from the US or navalised land-based fighters like the Sea Hurricane and the Seafire. Was this an issue of budgets, doctrine, inter-service rivalry, or a combination of some or all of the above? It's a little bit of all of the above, plus a few misnomers. One of the things I do actually plan on covering at some point in the future in collaboration with Rex's Hangar is this sort of myth that the Fleet Air Arm in the interwar period was obsessed with two-seater fighters, when in fact, if you look at all of the fighters that entered service with the Fleet Air Arm in that period, the majority are actually single-seaters. The era of the Skewer and the Fulmar at the very end of the 1930s is actually very much an anomaly within the grander scope of Fleet Air Arm fighters, at least in the prop-driven era. Now, on top of that, yes, you do have budgets. The Royal Navy didn't have a tremendously good budget for a lot of the interwar period, but in the late 1930s, which is when you'd expect them to be developing fighter aircraft that would see service on their carriers during the Second World War, there was an increased budget. However, it was also the time when the Royal Navy was finally wresting control of the Fleet Air Arm off of the RAF, and the later part of the 1930s is also a period of very confused doctrine for a lot of different services and different nations, because of how quickly technology was advancing. As I've mentioned before and covered briefly again here, the idea of the armoured flight deck for a carrier is the perfect solution to being within range of land-based enemy bomber fleets in a very narrow window between bombers getting fast enough to not be able to be intercepted, but also not having early warning from radar. Before that, the bombers are slow enough, your combat air patrol can attack them, so more fighters are better. And after that, radar can detect them, so more fighters are better. But you have this narrow window. And similarly, you have a narrow window in the late 1930s where multi-role aircraft look like they might be, quite a viable thing because of the massive performance boost you're getting out of things like stress skin construction, monoplanes, much more powerful engines, and that's where you get things like the Blenheim and the Battle from as well. And that's just for the British. There's a whole raft of other designs in American, French, German, etc. service, which would also prove themselves to be not quite all that they were cracked up to be by the time war rolled around and everything had gone a generation still further forward. Doctrine's also part of it because the Royal Navy is thinking about having to operate within range of enemy bomber fleets, but bombers generally have longer range than fighters, so they're not anticipating getting so close to the enemy coast, at least during daylight hours, that enemy fighters can come out and be a major problem, at which point you need a longer range, easy to navigate aircraft that can stay up for a long time and only needs to have the performance to pick off bombers, which is where you get something like a Fulmar originating from. And if you're only going to carry a limited number of fighters, then being able to send up a fighter that can wander around doing combat air patrol for 2, 3, 4 hours before coming back is a much better way of utilizing, a dozen or 2 dozen fighters than if you're having to cycle up those same dozen to 2 dozen fighters every hour or two. And whilst it's not strictly inter-service rivalry, it is also a matter of inter-service priority. Again, as I've pointed out before, the US Navy and the Japanese have an additional basically 2 years to overhaul their fighter fleets on their carriers. And indeed, the Wildcat and the Zero are both introduced in that gap between the start of the Second World War in Europe and Japan and the US going at it in late 1941. Now, yes, Japan is at war with China before that, but that's not exactly a high-intensity war, at least in terms of the Imperial Japanese Navy and, peer competition and losing ships and aircraft and pilots, etc., at the rate they would do once they started taking on primarily the US Navy, but also the other allies in the Pacific region. And the Fleet Air Arm did have a number of specifications out for single-seat fighters in 1938, 1939, and even 1940, which would have been the equivalent of the Zero or Wildcat in developmental terms, in fact, possibly even fractionally earlier in some of the specifications cases. But the priority for single-seat fighter airframes and the engines to power them, especially the fully navalized version of the Spitfire that was under consideration, that all went over to the RAF as soon as war broke out as a priority, which meant that essentially the Royal Navy's version of the Wildcat or the Zero, their kind of 1939, 1940-ish single-seat carrier fighter, which they were trying to develop, was stillborn as a result of the demands of the RAF for the Battle of France and the Battle of Britain, which then led to the situation where it was just easier to buy Martlets, aka Wildcats, and convert Sea Hurricanes and Seafires because they were already in service, as opposed to trying to do a crash fighter development program exclusively for the Fleet Air Arm in the middle of a war. David Bonds asks, you mentioned in the video on Implacable that the lower hangar was originally supposed to be able to carry float planes. What is the purpose of this? Were they going to operate from the carrier, used to resupply other capital ships, etc., etc.? Yes, well, the original intention was to operate aircraft a bit like the Walrus. Well, in fact, the Walrus, which you can see here. So the Supermarine Walrus, a small flying boat, essentially, which was the Royal Navy choice of aircraft for aerial reconnaissance on larger vessels. They would use things like the Sea Fox or a floatplane version of the Swordfish on ships with lesser capacity. But the Walrus was seen as, the choice for the modern cruisers, the modern battleships, and indeed for a while for something like Implacable. It was, long range, nice and stable. It was a good observation and recon aircraft. Wouldn't necessarily hold out too much of chances for its survival if it was ever intercepted, but for what it was a pretty solid entry. But as you can see from this Walrus, which is being hoisted, not on Implacable, by the way, this is Pegasus, the former Ark Royal, you can tell it's a pretty tall aircraft. So it's a biplane flying boat, although it also has landing gear. So you've got and it's a biplane where both wings are above the fuselage. So it's not even a case of, lower wing, i.e. mounted lower on the fuselage, and then the high wing above. The entire engine is above as well. And then, with landing gear deployed, it's still taller. Go and see the one at Yeovilton Fleet Air Museum. They're pretty tall aircraft. And so that's why they were thinking they were going to need the taller hangar, because it's quite a substantial recon aircraft. So that was the idea. And as it turned out, actually, the Walrus was pretty useful in a lot of other roles. Obviously not strictly a combat role against other aircraft, but it was big enough to carry some munitions for use against submarines, and being a seaplane or float plane, depending on exactly how you want to define it. I call it a seaplane because the hull is actually waterproof. The little outriggers there are just for stability. It also turned out to be very good for retrieving pilots from the ocean, because it could just saunter up to them. It was big enough that you could get them on board quite easily, and then it could just wander back to the carriers, which they actually did quite regularly in the Pacific, in the latter part when the British Pacific Fleet was out there. And again, because of their relatively substantial size, they could be used to a certain degree for an early form of carrier onboard delivery, what we would call it today, essentially taking small but vital supplies of parts and spares between ships in the fleet and also passengers. So, if you had a new admiral coming aboard, the Walrus had this wonderful versatility of it could take off from a very rough airfield, it could take off from no airfield at all if you happen to just be in a port, it could be hoisted aboard ships, it could land on a carrier, it could land next to a ship and be hoisted up onto the ship. It could go almost anywhere. So it was a very versatile little aircraft, and actually one of my secret favourites. Logan Hesse asks, have you done a guide on the SS Jeremiah O'Brien? I tried searching and didn't find anything. I haven't as of yet, primarily because she's still in existence, and so for ships that are still in existence, I generally try to actually get out to the ship to have a look around them, and then I can do a full guide to them. Now, obviously, early on in the channel's life, when I didn't think I was going to have anywhere near the funding to go and visit museum ships overseas, I have covered ships like Bliskovica, and there was an initial video series on the Iowas as well, which I did obviously before visiting them. But nowadays, I can be fairly confident that if I want to go and see a museum ship, then I'll do that first and then cover it, rather than cover it and then have to go, oh yeah, well, by the way, also this. So the reason I haven't covered SS Jeremiah O'Brien yet is because I haven't managed to go and visit her yet. Well, partly that's just been a matter of time and so many ships to visit, and to be perfectly honest, those of you who are in the US will understand what I say when I say, part of the issue is she is currently berthed in San Francisco, and this may just be me reading news and media reports from over here in the UK, but I have a hesitation about traveling to San Francisco with any degree of expensive camera equipment in my car. So yeah, I'm sure there are ways around this to, get from the airport to ships without risking life, limb, and equipment. But once I work those out, then I will make an attempt to go and visit, well, both this vessel and the numerous other vessels like Hornet, etc., that are present in San Francisco Bay. Dennis Nichols asks, since the Lord Nelsons and Dreadnought are near contemporaries, was turbine power ever considered for the Lord Nelsons? And if not, why not? If turbines had gone into them, what might have been the various effects, including operational viability? Well, the immediately obvious thing would be they would be faster, but there would be a trade-off in range. So, for reference, the Lord Nelsons, if they're cruising, can go almost, not quite, but almost half again as far as Dreadnought can. So the Dreadnought has an operational range of just over 6,500 nautical miles, travelling at a cruising speed of 10 knots. The Lord Nelsons have a cruising range of just over 9,000 nautical miles at 10 knots. So same cruising speed, but considerably further in operational distance, purely because they're using triple expansion steam engines versus the turbines in Dreadnought, because of course they haven't got gearing, etc. sorted. So Dreadnought's faster and smoother, but she can't go quite as far. But as for if there was discussion about using turbines in the Lord Nelsons, I can't see any particular evidence that there was. The weird thing is that the Lord Nelsons actually had a rather protracted design history over the course of quite a few years. There are a lot of arguments going back and forth as to what they should be, how they should be armed, and almost every permutation of firepower and protection was looked at on them, including some all big gun designs, with an all 12-inch and an all 10-inch armament. But whilst there were huge arguments over displacement and firepower and protection, no one really seems to have raised any issue over what the ship should be powered with. There was just this general assumption that they would be powered by vertical triple expansion engines, and depending on how many boilers you stuck in and what the size and displacement of the ship was, would dictate how fast it was. But yeah, there was certainly no discussion, at least as far as I can see, of looking at turbine power for them. I think that's probably because their original design thoughts actually date from a period when turbines only very just being introduced into navies at all. And then with Dreadnought, it's really Fisher pushing really hard that gets them to switch over to turbines. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, on a previous Drydock you mentioned that the Elco Thunderbolt was too weak to do any significant damage against other torpedo boats. However, I remember hearing a bit of hearsay that the Thunderbolt was experimentally mounted on a few larger vessels and tested as an anti-aircraft platform, particularly against kamikaze attack. Do you have any information on this? And also, if the Elco Thunderbolt's development had come about earlier in the war, do you think it could have been a popular option for light anti-aircraft armament amongst Allied vessels? Now, bearing in mind, you will see various options of the Thunderbolt, because there's a model that's got 2 Oerlikons and 450 cals. You've got this version which has 4 Oerlikons and 250 cals, and there's another version that just has the 4 Oerlikons. But you get the general drift of what the mount is generally supposed to be like. Yes, some Thunderbolts were experimentally mounted on older US battleships. Apparently it was 1 mount per battleship. They started off with a couple of them and on 2, obviously one on two battleships, and then expanded it across a fair number of the older ones. There isn't a huge amount of data that I've been able to see about exactly how successful they were, mostly because obviously there weren't that many mounts period, and they were deployed somewhat late in the war. But if a variant had been developed earlier in the war, would it have been a popular option? I think so. Now, there would have been limitations to it, because obviously a powered, let's say, quadruple 20mm mounting, because the 50 cals are not really going to be that useful as anti-aircraft weapons, would take up a fair bit of weight. It would have probably more weight to it than 4 single or 2 twin 20mm Oerlikons, albeit that in terms of overall impact, it would probably take up less space than 4 single 20mm. The main thing, however, that I can see from a attractiveness point of view would have been that statistically you could actually fit even more Oerlikons aboard for a relatively small increase in crew. Because, of course, if you have 4 single 20mm Oerlikons, then at the very minimum, bearing in mind you will have people who need to be manning these things, not quite 24/7, but near enough. If you've got 4 singles, that means you have to have at least 1 person on each of those, plus potentially a loader, plus 4 different sets of ammunition distribution handling. Whereas in a Thunderbolt mount, you just have 1 guy, as you can see there from the seat on the left, in charge of all 4 guns. So that's immediately reduced the necessary crew complement by 3. You probably will still need at least a couple of people doing reloads, but that's still potentially a crew reduction. And that actually probably would save a lot of weight compared to the singles, because it's not just the weight of 3, 4, 5 crew that you're saving. You're also talking about you don't need food supplies for 3 to 5 men for however many months you're going to be out and about. You don't need to ration your water for an extra 3 to 5 men. You don't need to have an extra 3 to 5 bunks available. You don't need to have potentially an extra galley staff to cook for the additional men. And of course, if you multiply that across the sort of 40, 50, 60, 20mm you would find on a lot of Allied warships in the mid to late war period, you might end up reducing your crew overhead by more than 100 men. And that's a lot of bunks, that's a lot of space, that's a lot of food, that's a lot of weight, etc. that you're saving from the ship. Probably far more than compensating for any potential weight issues with the mount in and of itself. And I can particularly see it being a popular option actually for very small Allied craft like corvettes, frigates and destroyer escorts, because if you look at, say, something like a Flower-class corvette or equivalent, you might have 2, 3 or 4 20mm Oerlikons singles spaced out, 1 on each bridge wing, maybe 1 aft, something like that, in an attempt to provide general all-round fire. But again, you need 3, 4, 5 people to man them all. Whereas one of these, again, assuming we're going with the quad 20mm only version, you could put that somewhere aft, have pretty much all-round coverage, but coverage with more barrels in all directions, and need a reduction of crew to actually man them. So yeah, An earlier version, before aircraft started outranging the 20mm Oerlikon as a general point of principle, could be extremely useful. A typical programmer asks, were some of the lower-ranking French officers and sailors who were stuck in Alexandria, who favoured continuing the fight, able to defect to the Free French-British? Yes, whilst the information I was able to find was relatively sparse, I was able to confirm that during their time in Alexandria, where technically the fleet was just immobilized, various small groups of French sailors and the occasional officer who did want to continue the fight under Free French colours were able to make their way from the French ships, because of course they were still also allowed leave, and some of them just went on leave from their ships and didn't come back and reported to nearby, Free French recruiting officers and or the British authorities and said, hey, look, we want to keep on fighting the Nazis. At which point, obviously, everyone's like, yeah, great, fantastic. Here we go. Grab a gun, jump on this ship, etc., and off we go. And they would continue to fight throughout the Second World War, although their reception back aboard the French ships at Alexandria, as and when that squadron eventually did in 1943 weigh in on the Allied side, I wasn't able to find any specific information about that, but there were suggestions that it was a little bit awkward. But nonetheless, all credit to them. They were determined to continue the fight, though the men who put themselves out there, and they did so. As was covered in the Admiral Cunningham video, there were a fair number of French crews who were quite happy to continue on fighting, and probably would have done so if not for the very, very strict orders from on high en masse. And obviously some were determined enough to find their way out to do that anyway. Niels Larsen asks, do you think the Mers el Kabir tragedy could have been avoided if the officers, so to speak, on the ground were allowed to handle it without backseat diplomacy from the government? Honestly, I don't know. I mean, I would really like to think so. But approaching it from a perspective of what does the evidence show, I unfortunately edge towards possibly not, because the situation in Alexandria and the situation at Mers el Kabir were slightly different. I mean, for one thing, with the best will in the world, the ships at Mers el Kabir, especially Dunkirk and Strasbourg, were far more lethal and far more valuable than the ones at Alexandria, which explains partially the increased pressure. They were also considerably closer to both mainland France and possible relief from Toulon, and Axis holdings as well, as compared to the French fleet in Alexandria, which was miles away from any of that. And that obviously would increase governmental pressure. And of course, the whole thing is taking place, whereas in Alexandria, it's taking place across the harbour, with both fleets fully in sight of each other. With Mers el Kabir, it's taking place at a distance with shuttle diplomacy going on. Cunningham and Godefroy have a good, well-established existing relationship to try and work with, whereas Somerville and Jean-Soul do not. And attitude-wise, whilst Godefroy would later become relatively intransigent because of very, very stringent orders from Vichy, Jean-Soul, as I've covered before in the Mers el Kabir video, seems to have just been incredibly difficult and intransigent generally as a person, let alone in that particular situation, which kind of dialed everything up to 11. And of course, again, with Alexandria, Cunningham could to a certain extent afford to ignore orders from London because he had the luxury of his ships were right there. They weren't going anywhere. Somerville, he has a limited time on station because he is actively cruising off of Mers el Kabir. And then, of course, even with all that taken into account for Alexandria, it very nearly went horribly wrong. And Cunningham obviously had to resort to, loud hailing and chalk messaging things to the entire crews of the French ships there to get the ice broken and get things moving, which is going to be next to impossible to do at Mers el Kabir because the British ships aren't going to be in the port. So whilst in theory it's possible that Somerville could have done something like, get all his, well, not the whole ultimatum because it would have been far too long, but get some pre-seed version of it, done up and maybe have, jury-rigged a swordfish with a set of loudspeakers and a French-speaking officer and had them fly around Mers el Kabir at low altitude, loud hailing everybody as to what was going on, and maybe that would have broken the deadlock. I think a lot of the finer details that were present that just about managed to resolve the Alexandria situation just aren't present at Mers el Kabir. As I said, I'd really like and hope that something might change, and without the backseat driving of the politicians, perhaps the negotiations would have gone on longer and perhaps something would have been resolved. But realistically, the only way I can see Mers el Kabir not ending in tragedy with the way the whole situation was at the time and how everything had been set up would be, that aforementioned kind of, if you have a bunch of swordfish sailing around and not being shot at by anti-aircraft defences, just broadcasting the actual British terms to the whole of the French crews, because there's obviously a lot of French crew present at Mers el Kabir. And if all the various officers and men all are hearing this, and given the way Jean-Saul was acting, he's almost certainly not telling them the full story. He's certainly not even telling his superiors the full story. That may induce either enough of them to make representations to Jean-Saul to get him to back down, although his personality doesn't seem very prone to that, or there may just well be enough of them to go, look, you're lying to us flat out. We actually think one or more of these options is viable, and if you're going to lie to us, then we're going to do our own thing, and screw you, we're out. At which point, even if the collective will of the French crews is, well, we don't think we can fight for the British, but we can go and inter ourselves in the French West Indies or in America, either option is a far superior option to, being shot at. Peters asks, you talk a lot about the effort made in ship design in terms of armour thickness and gun calibre. My question is, how much of a difference did that make in actual battle? Was the extra inch of armour or gun calibre actually decisive most of the time? Or were softer factors like experience, command quality, fire control, deck layout, reliability and luck frequently more important? Softer factors like command quality, experience of the crew, how good is your fire control system, etc., and sheer blind luck are hugely important in the outcome of practically any naval battle, that is for certain. And quite often, because in a lot of naval engagements you had ships that were not a million miles away from each other in capability facing off against each other, it very often would come down to those softer factors to see who had a decisive advantage. But underlying all that, there are certainly times when armour thickness and gun calibre fairly regularly do have a fairly significant influence on the overall outcome of a battle. So, for example, at the very, very low end, the fact that most destroyers were not armoured at all versus, say, a Fletcher class with 1-inch STS plating, which is admittedly only really splinterproof armour, but still, it did make a fair bit of difference, because you look at how many Fletchers were involved in some fairly heavy fighting in the Pacific and how many of them were damaged, and then you compare that similar level of damage being inflicted on other destroyers in other theatres, or even other destroyers in the same theatre, and the Fletchers seem oddly survivable, oddly tough, and that's because that little bit of splinterproofing meant that they were far, far, far less susceptible to leaks and other forms of damage from near misses, splinter damage, shock damage, etc., which turned out to actually be the killers of quite a lot of destroyers, or maybe cripple a destroyer such that it can then be finished off. So that's a low-end case of armour making a difference. But another example would, for example, be the battlecruiser engagement at Jutland. Now, whilst that engagement didn't really go particularly well for the British battlecruisers, it could have gone a lot worse. because there are quite a number of hits that are inflicted, particularly on Tiger, but also on some of the other British 13.5-inch armed ships, at least, where their, relatively speaking, thin belt armour was able to stop German 11-inch primarily and occasionally 12-inch shells. Now, they still would take damage, but it prevented the shell from punching through and entering the ship and obviously doing something even more catastrophic. But when you look at the penetration values for the British 13.5-inch guns, when the fuses work, and obviously when you look at the damage the German ships took, there were quite a number of penetrations to their armour, including some areas that were much, much thicker thicknesses of armour than the British had on their belts. If the Germans had bigger, heavier guns on their battle cruisers, then those guns could potentially have actually punched through, well, almost certainly would have punched through on the belt hits that historically were rejected on ships like Tiger, which could have had much more catastrophic consequences, therefore, for the British. And sometimes when things were at a bit more of an extreme, there could be some fairly definite advantages and or disadvantages seen. Because, if you look at the Scharnhorsts, they've got whatever type of armour protection you subscribe to for them. They've still got okay-ish armour, or good armour. Again, it varies, but whatever. They've not got not bad armour. Their armour is not bad. They've got good speed, but they are armed with 11-inch guns. And that means that when they come up against older ships, now obviously there is also the whole raider issue of if they are raiders and they get damaged, that's it, pretty much it for them, whereas a convoy escort vessel that's damaged is probably going to be okay. But nonetheless, if you replaced Scharnhorst and Gneisenau with equivalents carrying twin 15-inch guns instead of triple 11s, and they come across HMS Malaya, there's much, much better odds of them being able to take on and sink Malaya than with their triple 11s. Or the action at Lofoten. Renown is not as well protected as Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, but she has much bigger, heavier hitting guns, even if she has fewer of them, and so she has the confidence to run in and take on both German ships at once, and the Germans end up ceding the field. Or at Scharnhorst's final battle, at the Battle of North Cape, if Scharnhorst had been armed with twin 15-inch, not necessarily saying she wouldn't have run from Duke of York, because she was ambushed, and Duke of York obviously had lots of cruiser and destroyer friends around, but Duke of York, when she was chasing down Scharnhorst, was able to try and chase down Scharnhorst and try and keep the range as close as possible with a fair degree of confidence that Duke of York's battleship-grade protection would stand up to 11-inch gunfire. If Scharnhorst had been shooting back with 15-inch guns, I'm not saying Duke of York wouldn't have pursued, but they might have been a bit more cautious about doing so. Brendan Buersdorf asks, the Italian and German submarine campaigns in the Mediterranean and Atlantic often get a lot of attention for obvious reasons, but what were British submarine operations like in these regions, and did they have anywhere near the success of the Germans or the Italians? Conversely, what do German anti-submarine efforts look like, and were they anywhere near as effective as the Allies? British submarine operations in World War II simply couldn't be as successful as the German ones, for the simple fact of the matter, German merchant ships were pretty much non-existent. There was obviously trade with Sweden, but you had to be careful not to blow up neutral shipping, and also the problem of getting into the Baltic, so they tended to leave that mostly to the Russians. There was obviously ships coming down from occupied Norway, which you could go after, but the number of active German merchant ships at any one time was a drop in the bucket compared to the number of Allied merchant ships available at any one time. And so, just sheer target density was in favour of the Germans when it came to submarine campaigns. Plus, of course, with a much smaller number of shipping routes being operated by the Axis, at least the European Axis, it was much easier for them to concentrate their ASW assets, particularly aircraft, because they're all fairly close range, as well as ships. In terms of technology, German anti-submarine warfare started off with tech that's basically, on average on a par with Allied tech. Now, There are some areas like hydrophones at the beginning of the war where the Germans are actually considerably ahead. Other areas like active sonar where the Germans have it, but they don't have it quite developed to the same level as the Allies. But as the war goes on, the Allies pull ahead with anti-submarine technology, further refinements of sonar, more distributed sonar, various innovative anti-submarine weapons. And the German anti-submarine warfare technology tends to start lagging and falling further and further behind simply because it's not as prioritized as actual submarine weapons are, because obviously the Germans are operating large submarine fleets against merchant shipping and being attacked by anti-submarine warfare. So obviously they're going to prioritize technology for the U-boats more than the relatively small number of anti-submarine warfare escorts they themselves have. The Italians, who are operating fairly regular convoys, obviously, to and from North Africa, actually, if anything, are probably better overall anti-submarine warfare specialists than the Germans by 1943. Again, simply because of priorities, they have a lot riding on anti-submarine warfare efforts, so they're forced to develop their technology and tactics considerably more than the Germans are. So what you end up seeing is that outside of, going after North Africa convoys and the occasional German convoy from Scandinavia, most British submarines for a good chunk of the war actually are either trying to hunt down enemy warships, which is much more difficult and dangerous for obvious reasons, because they're the only things on the sea that they can realistically go after, or they are actually acting much in the way that Age of Sail frigates used to act, i.e. sitting right off of enemy ports reporting on what they're doing, which in and of itself is, again, quite a hazardous duty, but they're much better suited for it, obviously, in World War II than surface warships because they are much harder to spot and see. Wienve asks, during World War II there were several speed build demonstrations of bomber aircraft and Liberty ships for propaganda purposes. Were there ever, in the period the channel covers, similar record attempts made with the construction of naval ships? There was a fair bit of competition within yards and between yards, so obviously between separate shipyards and also within work teams within individual yards, to try and get ships into the water as fast as humanly possible, particularly when you're talking about the smaller ships, so escorts, destroyers, even escort carriers for that matter. But when it came to the bigger stuff, cruisers, full fleet carriers, battleships, normally not so much, because suddenly you're talking about some very expensive, very important capital assets. Now, whilst construction could be accelerated or prioritized, as would happen with some of the Essexes, or Implacable, for instance, which was prioritized over Vanguard, that's more of a trying to get it done in a reasonably safe but rapid time period, not so much we're trying to set a record for who can build a fleet carrier the fastest possible. One of the very few times there's an exception to that, of course, is HMS Dreadnought, where Fisher is absolutely determined to get that ship in the water in as few work days as he can possibly do. But it was an interesting approach, let's put it that way. But yeah, when it comes to the big expensive capital assets, racing people is usually not a good idea, and most people didn't go for it. There was, however, a certain standard of speed which yards would take pride in, and could also be used as a benchmark when you have multiple yards all trying to build the same class of ship. And this actually comes up quite often in British battleship building, especially from sort of 1890s through to the 1910s, where Royal Dockyards, who of course are, they're just getting paid because they're the Royal Dockyards, you build ships for the Royal Navy, that is the reason for your existence, they just keep churning out ships because why not? Get them in the water as quickly as possible, good for the service, good for you, great. It might give you a few days break before they stick the next one down. But then you have the commercial shipyards who, of course, not only are being paid on for materials and to build the ship, but they're also able to put in bills for per day wage costs. And somehow, suddenly, they seem to be taking longer to build their version of the same class, do the same drawings with the same spec. And in those cases, in a rare moment of competency, the British government was able to turn around and say, well, hang on a minute, this is exactly the same ship. The Royal Dockyards can do it in, say, 2 years and 6 months. Why are you taking 3? This seems very suspicious. And that served to rein in the commercial dockyards from excessive profiteering most of the time. Patrick Donnelly asks, had Ark Royal survived past 1941, how would she be able to handle US aircraft such as Wildcats, Hellcats, Corsairs and Avengers compared to the Illustrious and Implacable-Class carriers? So Ark Royal would have done a lot better than any of the other British fleet carriers for a couple of reasons. The Implacables, as covered in the Implacable video, and Indomitable, the kind of halfway house between the Illustriouses and the Implacables, they had shorter hangars in terms of height, although Indomitable had one taller, one shorter hangar. The 3 other Illustriouses, so Illustrious, Victorious, and Formidable, had a single 16-foot hangar. Ark Royal also had a 16-foot hangar height, but Ark Royal, unlike the Illustriouses, had 2 hangars, and Ark Royal's lower hangar had 95%-ish the hangar area of the Illustrious's single hangar, and then on top of that it had another hangar, the top hangar, which was again 16 foot high, but had something in the order of 20% or so more hangar area than, again, the Illustrious's single hangar. So between the two, Ark Royal actually had something more like 220 to 230% the hangar space of an Illustrious class. So Ark Royal would have done better than actually the later British carriers in terms of ease of handling Avengers and Hellcats, etc., about the same as Victorious, Illustrious and Formidable, but we know they could operate anything up to Avengers, so she could have done those, but she would have been able to carry an awful lot more of them. 2 full hangars worth plus deck parking. And of course, unlike the Illustriouses, she was also designed initially to handle 70 plus aircraft, so she would have had deeper magazines and fuel reserves. Brian Stevens asks, you've commented several times that Age of Sail battles lasted much longer than movies can show. But how long did the battles go on anyway? I acknowledge something like the long chase between frigates, as in Master and Commander, might be an outlier. Actually, long chases weren't uncommon. I mean, they weren't the rule, but 2 ships chasing each other for a long period before coming to decisive action, or, a couple of fleets chasing each other for a while, that really wasn't that unusual. The War of 1812 single frigate duels, I mean, single ship actions tend to be over a little bit quicker anyway, but those frigate duels were actually quite fast and vicious for, battles of the time, and even those took a fair bit of time to actually resolve. The fact that a battle was over in, less than 2 hours was seen as unusually quick. So for some examples, the duel between Indefatigable and Amazon on one side and Droit de l'Homme on the other took just about 11 hours and probably would have gone on longer if they hadn't realised, hang on, we're in the middle of a bay, we're about to go aground, and taken evasive action, which obviously only Indefatigable managed to pull off. The Battle of Trafalgar lasted about 5.5 hours from start to finish, and that was, again, a particularly vicious battle. The Battle of the Glorious 1st of June started in the early morning and lasted all the way through till just after lunchtime. So typically you could expect a large Age of Sail battle to last at least half a day, possibly a whole day, and that's before you start to get into battles where action was broken off and rejoined. And then, of course, as you get further back, you get to the rather aptly named 4 days battle. So, yeah, quite a considerable time when you think about the fact that even battleships that were engaged in a fight that didn't sink due to magazine explosions are usually, gone from first shots being fired to ship has gone under the water in less than half the time that a typical Age of Sail battle could last. Vokir asks, in the modern day, ship naming conventions are often subject to a complex and very committee-driven selection process for a variety of mostly political reasons. How much did these concerns play into the names of ships during the period the channel covers? It definitely gets more and more political as a rule towards the end of the period that the channel covers, but within the period it also depends quite a lot on the size of the ship. These days, even the largest navies have relatively few surface combatants compared to the largest navies for the time period the channel covers, and so almost every name has to become a political football to be fought over. Whereas, back in the day, the names of the really big capital ships, like the first-rate ships of the line or the ironclads, would to a certain extent become politicized depending on the time period, depending on the ship. So, for Victory, HMS Victory, the one that's in Portsmouth now, for example, there wasn't really a huge amount of discussion with that one. It was just, we need to build a first rate. Hey, we recently lost a ship called Victory and she was a first rate. Should we reuse the name so we still have a Victory that's a first rate? Yeah, cool, great, fantastic, let's go. Sometimes when royal names and succession issues were a little bit of an issue, then there could be a lot of discussion. So part of the reason that the King George V class are King George V, Prince of Wales and Duke of York for the first three, rather than King George VI, which is what it should have been, following British naval tradition. That's all to do with the abdication crisis, etc., that meant that we had a King George VI and not a King Edward the whatever. But then with other navies, like the US Navy, once they settled into battleships get state names, apart from a little bit of a tussle here and there as to which particular state got to stick its name on the latest battleship, there wasn't a huge amount of argument going on. Whereas if you look at the amount of horse trading there was over the various names for the Essex-class carriers, it's almost like night and day. But when you get down to the smaller ships, where they're building dozens or even hundreds of the things, no one in higher office really particularly seems to care. You can send lists of almost anything up to them for technical approval, and they're just like, yeah, sign it off, whatever. No one cares if there's a schooner called HMS Pickle out there, no matter how much mockery that might get, because it's not really seen as particularly important. Because, if somebody really objects to that, well, there's like 50 others of that class floating around, so go be angry at one of those. But as a general rule, the smaller the navy, the more politically charged the names get, and that's pretty much for the same reason as everything gets politically charged these days. When you've only got a few ships to name, everyone has to mean something to somebody, otherwise people get very antsy about it. When you've got tons of ships, with outside of the few issues I've just mentioned, no one particularly minds if this particular ship doesn't get named after something they want, because, hey, there's going to be like 6 more coming down the line by the end of the year, and you can maybe get one of those instead. Gallias of Martinengo asks, how effective were US Navy and Imperial Japanese Navy carrier escorts at assisting the capital ships when under air attack? Now, I wasn't necessarily sure if you meant the ships that escorted carriers and were referring to capital ships as fleet carriers and battleships, or if you meant carriers escorting capital ships as in carriers escorting battleships. So I'll try and answer both. In the rare cases where you had carriers escorting battleships for a particular purpose, so, shore bombardment duty in the Pacific, for example, or most Mediterranean fleet operations, come to think of it, broadly, the carriers tended to do relatively well, but there was a degree of what you might call Dunkirk beach syndrome. And to explain that, when the evacuations were going on at Dunkirk, one of the things that people who were there would often say was, where was the RAF? They were expecting to see Spitfires and Hurricanes tearing it up with German aircraft in the skies above them, and they didn't see any of that, so of course they thought the RAF was being useless. However, that was very unfair, because what the RAF were doing was they were actually attacking much larger, much better organised bomber and fighter streams coming to attack Dunkirk inland over mainland France, and actually stopping a good chunk of the aircraft that were heading in to attack Dunkirk from ever getting there. So whilst the attacks on Dunkirk itself were quite bad, they were nowhere near as bad as they would have been had the RAF not been, intercepting those raids further out, which was actually the better thing to do, because if you intercept them directly above the target, well, those bombers can still drop bombs. And it was a similar thing if you had capital ships being escorted by carriers. The carriers, of course, would get fighters up. They would try and coordinate a defense, and those fighters would generally try and intercept enemy attack aircraft much further out, because A, that gives them the longest possible engagement window, and B, it means that once those aircraft get in range of friendly anti-aircraft defenses, then normally the friendly fighters can break off and let the anti-aircraft defenses have free rein, or in some cases you can kind of take your life into your hands and hope that the anti-aircraft gunners know how to recognize a friendly aircraft from an enemy one. But either way, it of course would mean that from the perception of the capital ships, they were being attacked by enemy aircraft they had to defend themselves against with little to no apparent fighter support. But that would be not because they didn't have it, but because the fighter support was further out, preventing even worse coming for them. The flip side of how effective were escorting vessels associated with carriers at keeping carriers and so forth from being hit. Now, obviously, that's more of a direct fire control, direct fire support mission with your anti-aircraft guns. That, of course, varies hugely. Japanese escort formations, mostly due to a lack of particularly effective anti-aircraft guns and fire control equipment, tended to put on a reasonable show, but generally speaking, outside of some early war incidents, they weren't particularly effective at actually stopping the US aircraft coming in to attack the capital ships, even if they might occasionally break up a formation. And to be fair, the flip side was pretty much also true in the early part of the war. But as the war progressed, then obviously with more anti-aircraft guns, more remote power control, more and better fire control systems, radar, etc., US carrier escorts, destroyers, cruisers, etc., got much, much better at breaking up and dealing with enemy aircraft incoming before they got anywhere close to the carriers. Obviously, it wasn't 100% foolproof, but you've also got to remember that sometimes capital ships were carrier escorts. Battleships would ride escort on aircraft carriers for anti-aircraft fire support as much as anything else. And occasionally, like at some of the Guadalcanal carrier battles, that did have quite an interesting effect, because you could draw off enemy bombers who would then go after the battleship, which spared the carrier, which overall was a net gain because the battleship was much better able to take the punishment if it was hit than the carrier was. You think about, for example, USS South Dakota, when she's riding escort for one of the Guadalcanal carrier battles. If a series of Japanese dive bombers, say, hit South Dakota with 3 or 4 550-pound bombs, I mean, she's not going to treat it like it's nothing, but as a combat unit, South Dakota can broadly shrug that off outside of, very, very critical hits to certain spaces. Whereas if a US fleet carrier like Enterprise or Saratoga gets hit by 3 or 4 550-pound bombs scattered across the flight deck, they're going to be out of action. And finally, Thomas Dudkiewicz asks, in the age of sail, how much choice did captains have over their choice of senior officers? More precisely, could a Royal Navy captain, for example, request a specific officer who was currently on leave or half pay, a specific officer who was on another ship, if his current captain agreed, and when getting a new command, could a specific officer be transferred with them? And was this different in other navies? So to start off with the first bit, yes, this would vary between navies. Some of it based on culture, but also a lot of it based on size. Weirdly enough, things would be relatively similar in very large and very small navies. It would be the mid-sized navies where you'd see perhaps more resistance to captains being able to dictate who they did and didn't have on board in most circumstances. In smaller navies, it would be the case of, there are so few officers that almost everybody knows everybody, so this kind of unspoken quid pro quo system would exist to a certain extent. And, again, if you've only got a choice of, say, a dozen senior captains, then probably a good idea to accommodate their requests, because you don't really have that many other options. Whereas mid-sized Navy, you've got just enough officers that you don't have to tolerate that kind of thing, and not enough officers that it doesn't matter quite so much, and or connections can't be built. Now, for the Royal Navy, it depends pretty much on three things: circumstances, fame, and connections. So if an officer has connections, high up in the Admiralty, or perhaps amongst the nobility and the political classes who can then obviously influence the Admiralty, then they're much more likely to get their way generally than someone with no connections. Circumstances will also play a great deal into it. So, for example, if it's a new command, i.e. a ship with no existing officers or any crew really is being newly commissioned, and the ship the captain is on is presumably being paid off or decommissioned, then saying, well, I'd like to take this officer, and this officer with me to my new ship is not going to be very difficult to manage at all. Whereas if you are, let's say, on blockade duty, but, let's say your ship is a frigate, maybe a 6th rate, and let's say the captain of a 74 gunner has fallen ill or died or has been relieved of duty or whatever, and you're being transferred to the 74 to take command, well, that 74 gun ship is a much bigger, much more valuable asset. And so from the commanding admiral's point of view, a 6th rate whose captain is taken off, well, he might go, okay, well, your first lieutenant is going to be breveted to captain to look after that ship until we can get someone in to take over, or he might get to keep the ship if he does a good enough job, and you're being transferred to fill this one specific slot, that of captain of this capital ship that's on blockade duty. If you then turn around and say, well, actually, I'd like to take my 2 lieutenants with me to the 74 gunner, the admiral's going to almost certainly turn around and say no, because the 74 gunner already has a full set of lieutenants. And if you take the 3 senior most staff from a 6th rate, they're really going to be in trouble. So, in that's a circumstance. Whereas, for example, if you are the reverse situation of, let's say there's a really nice, brand new 5th rate, heavy 5th rate, small, even a small 4th rate, and there's a particular enemy frigate out there that's menacing convoys and needs to be taken, but perhaps it's come out with a skeleton crew, or it's come out with a crew to reinforce and crew another ship, and there's a basic crew but not a huge amount, if any, officers, and you're being pulled off a rank and file small 3rd rate, being told, right, you need to take this premium ship out and do some real damage or hunt down this particularly annoying person. If you say, well, if you want me to do this very specialist task, I want this officer, and this officer, then you're much more likely to get your request granted. And then, of course, you have fame. So, yeah, if Nelson turns around and says, okay, I'm going to this ship, I would like to take these officers with me, the chances of him getting his way versus, Captain Nobody, who just worked his way up the ranks and has only just got his recent command, they're going to view these as 2 very, very different people. And, one's request might be granted, the other one definitely not. So, and getting to your other 2 sub-questions, a specific officer who's currently on leave or half pay, if there is an available slot for him in the ship's company, that won't be much of a problem, because whilst, yes, it means he has to come off half pay and the Admiralty have to pay him in full, if the captain is able to turn around and say, well, you know what, we have let's say on a ship of the line, we have 2 lieutenant spaces open. Well, I happen to know this really good lieutenant who's currently on half pay, and I want him for this slot. For the Admiralty, that just means they've got to find 1 lieutenant. So fantastic, great, whatever, have him. And then for the other one, specific officer on another ship, if the other captain agrees, so a transfer between 2 active duty ships, that is most likely, well, in a small squadron or flotilla or just at sea, that's probably going to be just an arrangement between captains. If it's a larger vessel or you're part of a flotilla, or a larger flotilla or a fleet, then you would have to reference up to the admiral. But if the officer is willing, the captain on the other ship is willing, and it's not going to leave either ship short-staffed or overcrowded, generally speaking, as long as there's a decent enough reason for it, that request will probably be granted. The big variations is going to be basically, are all the command slots on a particular ship filled? In which case the Admiralty is going to want to know, well, who are you kicking off and why, which gets a lot more difficult. Or is it going to leave the other ship critically short-staffed? So, as I mentioned, if you try to take 2 lieutenants with you off of a 6th rate, that's going to be very difficult unless that ship is paying off. Whereas if you were on a 1st rate and you wanted to take 2 lieutenants with you, that's going to be a lot easier of an ask because there's just a lot more of them on the ship to pick up the slack. And that brings us to the end of the Drydock for this week. Thank you very much for listening, everybody. Hope you've enjoyed this video, and see you again in another one soon. Thanks very much.